Hey guys, there's a strange pattern hidden inside the medieval world, one you don't notice at first. Not in the castles, not in the battles, not even in the grand laws written by kings, but in the small rules, the oddly specific ones. The kind that make you stop and wonder, why would anyone need a law for that? Why must travelers dismount before crossing a simple bridge? Why are rooftops blocked, sounds restricted, light controlled, animals rerouted, and even time itself regulated? These weren't random decisions. They weren't made out of caution alone. Each one traces back to a single moment. Unexpected, unsettling, and just unusual enough to leave a mark that couldn't be ignored. A collapse that no one saw coming. A misstep in a place that seemed safe. A sound that caused confusion. A reflection that blinded. A delay that split an entire system apart. One incident was all it took. And from that moment forward, behavior changed. Paths were redrawn. Habits became rules. And rules became law. Not because people imagined danger, but because they had already lived through it. This is a journey through those moments. The quiet disasters. The overlooked mistakes. The strange events that reshaped everyday life. Because in the medieval world, even the smallest incident could echo for centuries. There are places in the medieval world where the silence feels older than the stones themselves. Not simply quiet, but layered, settled by centuries of routine, punctuated only by the predictable rhythms of bells, hooves, and wind. In such places, laws did not begin as abstract ideas. They were not written in anticipation. They arrived afterward, shaped by memory, hardened by fear, and preserved by repetition. A law, in its earliest form, was often nothing more than a scar. In the northern reaches of a modest feudal territory, far from royal courts and their polished decrees, stood a village that had grown slowly along the bend of a narrow river. The water there moved lazily in warmer months, reflecting reeds and low timber bridges. Yet during the colder seasons it became something else entirely. Beneath a brittle surface, the current remained restless, shifting unseen. For generations, the villagers crossed that river without thought. The bridge was simple, its beams worn smooth by carts and bare feet alike. There were no railings, no markings, no warning signs carved into its posts. It did not need them. Everyone knew how to walk across it. Or so they believed. One winter, the frost came earlier than expected. It settled overnight, transforming the world into a brittle imitation of itself. Wood stiffened. Rope tightened. The familiar path to the bridge appeared unchanged, yet the structure had altered in ways that could not be seen at a glance. At dawn, as the first villagers made their way across, the bridge held. A cart laden with grain passed slowly, wheels creaking against the planks. A shepherd followed with his animals, their hooves clattering in uneven rhythm. Nothing seemed out of place. Then came the incident. It was not dramatic in its beginning. No thunder split the sky, no visible fracture warned of what was to follow. A merchant, new to the village, unfamiliar with the subtleties of the crossing, guided a heavily loaded mule toward the center of the bridge. The weight alone would not have caused concern in any other season. But the frost had stiffened the joints, making them less forgiving, less capable of absorbing strain. Halfway across, the structure shifted. The sound was subtle at first, a low groan that might have been mistaken for wind pressing against the beams. Then came a sharper crack, followed by the sudden, irreversible collapse of a central support. The planks tilted, the mule stumbled, and within seconds both animal and cargo disappeared into the water below. The current, stronger than it appeared beneath the frozen surface, pulled everything downstream. There were no immediate fatalities. The merchant survived, though injured, dragged from the shallows some distance away. The mule was lost. The goods, fine textiles intended for trade, vanished beneath the ice and were never recovered. What remained was not merely damage to a bridge. It was a rupture in certainty. For the first time, the villagers saw the crossing not as a stable feature of their world, but as something fragile, unpredictable, a structure that could betray them without warning. Repairs began quickly. Timber was gathered, supports reinforced, and the bridge restored within days. Yet the memory of the collapse lingered. It settled into conversations, into the pauses between daily tasks. People crossed more slowly now, their steps measured, their attention sharpened. But attention alone did not satisfy the growing unease. In the weeks that followed, The village reeve, a local official responsible for maintaining order, began to record accounts of the incident. Not just the collapse itself, but the conditions surrounding it. The early frost, the unfamiliar merchant, the weight of the cargo. Each detail was noted, considered, and revisited. From these observations emerged a question that had not been asked before. How could such an event be prevented? The answer, as it often did in that era, took the form of a rule. At first, it was simple. No heavily laden animal was to cross the bridge during periods of frost. The instruction was communicated informally, passed from one villager to another. Yet as weeks turned into months, the rule began to evolve. It was refined, expanded, and eventually carved into the very wood of the bridge itself. The inscription was not elaborate. It did not attempt to explain the reasoning behind the restriction. Instead, it stated plainly that during cold weather, all travelers must dismount and lead their animals across individually. Carts were to be unloaded before crossing, their contents carried by hand. To an outsider, the rule might have seemed excessive, time-consuming, even unnecessary, given that the bridge had been reinforced. But to the villagers, it represented something more than practicality. It was a response to a moment that had unsettled their understanding of stability. As years passed, the origin of the rule began to fade. New generations grew up with the carved instruction as a given, part of the landscape as much as the river itself. Few remembered the merchant or the lost mule. Fewer still could describe the exact nature of the collapse. Yet the law remained. Travelers unfamiliar with the village often questioned the requirement. Some complied without hesitation, sensing the weight of local custom. Others resisted, viewing it as an inconvenience imposed without reason. In such cases, the reeve, or whoever held the position in later years, would enforce the rule with quiet insistence. There were no dramatic punishments, no public spectacles meant to deter defiance. Instead, there was a steady expectation that the law would be followed, supported by the collective memory of a community that had once witnessed what could happen when it was not. Over time, the bridge became known not for its structure, but for the behavior it demanded. It was a place where movement slowed, where routine was interrupted by a deliberate act of caution. Travelers dismounted, carts were emptied, and for a brief moment, the urgency of journeys was set aside. In this way, a single incident, brief, contained, and largely forgotten in its specifics, had reshaped the habits of countless individuals. The law did not exist because of theory or foresight. It existed because something unexpected had occurred, and the memory of that occurrence had been preserved in wood, in practice, and in the quiet understanding that not all dangers announced themselves in advance. Beyond the village, similar patterns unfolded in countless other places. A market town might prohibit the stacking of goods beyond a certain height because of a collapse that had once injured several traders. A coastal settlement might enforce strict rules on the timing of departures after a vessel was lost to an unseasonable storm. In each case, the law traced its origin to a specific moment, often unusual, sometimes improbable, yet powerful enough to alter behavior long after the details had blurred. These laws, scattered across regions and shaped by local experiences, formed a patchwork of caution. They were not standardized. They did not emerge from a single authority. Instead, they reflected the diversity of medieval life, where each community responded to its own challenges in its own way. Some of these rules persisted for centuries, their origins obscured by time. Others faded as circumstances changed, replaced by new concerns and new incidents. Yet the underlying principle remained consistent. A single event, if it disrupted the sense of order deeply enough, could give rise to a lasting constraint. As the seasons continued to turn in the village by the river, the bridge stood firm. Frost came and went, each year bringing its familiar transformation. Travelers crossed with care, following the carved instruction without question. The merchant's fall into the icy water had become a distant echo, barely audible in the collective memory. Yet its influence endured, embedded in the simple act of leading an animal across a wooden span. In this quiet persistence, there was a kind of continuity that defined the medieval world. Change did not always arrive through grand decrees or sweeping reforms. Often, it began with something small, a moment of failure, a break in the expected, and from that moment grew a practice, a habit, a law. And so, across fields, towns, and distant roads, other stories waited. Incidents stranger than a collapsing bridge. Events that seemed, at first, too unlikely to shape the course of daily life. Yet they did, and from them emerged laws that, to later generations, would appear curious, excessive, or even irrational, until one looked closely enough to see the shadow of the incident that had given them form. The world of the Middle Ages was not governed solely by kings or councils. It was shaped, in countless subtle ways, by moments when ordinary life had gone unexpectedly wrong. Moments that refused to be forgotten. Far from the river crossings of the north, beyond the lowlands where frost shaped habit and caution, there existed a town where the air carried a different weight. It was not cold that defined this place, but heat, dry, persistent, and often unmoving. The streets were narrow and uneven, pressed between walls of pale stone that reflected sunlight in blinding fragments. Dust gathered in corners, in thresholds, in the folds of garments. It settled slowly, as though time itself had thickened. This town stood along a trade route that connected inland markets to distant coastal ports. Caravans passed through in steady intervals, bringing with them spices, cloth, metalwork, and stories that shifted with each telling. Movement was constant, yet within that movement there existed a rigid order, an unspoken understanding of where one belonged and how one should proceed. Among the many rhythms of the town, there was one that governed the upper spaces, the rooftops. Unlike the timbered settlements of wetter regions, the buildings here were constructed with flat roofs, designed to capture what little breeze the day might offer. These rooftops were not merely structural features. They served as extensions of living space. In the early morning and late evening, families ascended narrow stairways to sit, to work, to rest away from the confined interiors below. From above, the town revealed itself as a layered arrangement of surfaces, stone meeting stone, separated only by low parapets or simple edges. Movement across these rooftops was common. Neighbors passed between buildings without descending to the streets, carrying goods, exchanging items, maintaining a quiet flow that existed parallel to the bustle below. It was a system that required familiarity. Each step depended on knowledge of the terrain, where a surface was stable, where it sloped slightly, where a gap required careful crossing. Those who grew up within the town navigated these spaces with ease, their movements guided by memory rather than sight. But not everyone possessed that memory. One season, during a period of increased trade, a group of travelers arrived from a distant region where such architectural forms were unknown. Their homes had been built differently, their habits shaped by enclosed spaces and defined pathways. The concept of a shared rooftop landscape, open and interconnected, was unfamiliar. At first, their presence caused little disruption. They conducted their business in the markets, rested within designated lodgings, and prepared to continue their journey. Yet as days passed, the boundaries between visitor and resident began to blur. One evening, as the heat of the day receded and the town softened into shadow, a member of this group ascended to the roof of a lodging house. The intention was simple: to find relief in the cooler air, to observe the surroundings from a higher vantage point. From that elevated position, the town appeared calm, its complexities hidden beneath a uniform surface. What could not be seen from that vantage point was the subtle variation in height between adjacent buildings. The traveler moved forward, stepping from one section of roof to another, following a path that seemed continuous. The low parapets offered little indication of change, and in the dim light, distinctions blurred further. A misjudged step carried more consequence than it appeared. At the edge of one building, where the drop to the next was greater than expected, the surface gave way beneath an uncertain footing. There was no dramatic collapse, no structural failure, only a moment of imbalance, followed by a fall into the narrow space below. The alley where the fall ended was not designed for passage. It was a confined space, used for storage and refuse, its ground uneven and cluttered. The injuries sustained were severe, compounded by the difficulty of reaching the location quickly. By the time assistance arrived, the outcome had already been decided. The incident spread through the town with a quiet intensity. It was not the first time someone had fallen from a roof, yet it was the first involving an outsider unfamiliar with the environment. That distinction altered the way the event was perceived. For the residents, The rooftops were extensions of daily life, navigated with an ease that came from years of experience. For those without that experience, the same spaces presented hidden risks. The question that followed was not whether the rooftops were dangerous, but whether the town bore responsibility for those who did not understand them. In the days that followed, the local council convened within a shaded chamber near the central market. The members were not distant rulers, but individuals drawn from the town itself: merchants, craftsmen, landholders, each bringing a perspective shaped by their role in the community. Their discussions were measured, unfolding over several gatherings. The incident was examined from multiple angles, each detail considered in relation to existing practices. The presence of travelers, the design of buildings, the expectations placed upon those unfamiliar with local customs. There was no immediate agreement. Some argued that responsibility lay with the individual, that unfamiliarity did not absolve one from caution. Others suggested that the town, as a host to travelers, held an obligation to ensure their safety within its boundaries. Between these positions, a solution began to take form. It did not involve altering the structures themselves. The rooftops remained as they had been, their design suited to the climate and the needs of those who lived there. Instead, the focus shifted to access. A decision was reached that would reshape the movement between spaces. From that point forward, entry to rooftops from communal or lodging buildings was to be restricted. Stairways leading upward were to be secured, their use limited to residents or those explicitly permitted. Travelers, regardless of their intentions, were not to ascend without guidance. The rule extended further. In places where rooftops connected directly across multiple buildings, barriers were to be introduced at key transition points. Low walls were raised, not to obstruct entirely, but to signal a boundary, a physical indication that movement beyond that point required awareness. These changes were implemented gradually, integrated into the existing fabric of the town. The alterations were subtle, yet their presence altered behavior. Movement across rooftops became more deliberate, less fluid than before. The ease of passage gave way to a series of pauses, moments where one considered the path ahead. As with the bridge in the northern village, the origin of the rule began to recede over time. New travelers arrived, encountering the restrictions as part of the town's established order. They accepted the limitations without question, unaware of the incident that had prompted them. Residents adapted to the changes, incorporating them into their routines until they no longer felt unusual. Yet beneath this adaptation lay a shift in perception. The rooftops were no longer viewed solely as extensions of living space. They had acquired a secondary identity, one defined by potential risk. The barriers, the restricted access, the subtle interruptions in movement, all served as reminders that familiarity could not be assumed. In this way, a single misstep had reshaped an entire dimension of the town's spatial experience. Beyond the immediate environment, the implications of the rule extended into the broader patterns of travel and trade. Lodging houses adjusted their practices, informing guests of the restrictions upon arrival. Caravans incorporated the knowledge into their preparations, guiding members through unfamiliar spaces with increased care. The town itself became known for this particular regulation. Among traders and travelers, it was recognized as a place where access to elevated spaces was controlled, where movement was directed not only by convenience, but by a structured awareness of risk. Some viewed the rule as excessive, an unnecessary limitation imposed in response to a rare occurrence. Others saw it as a practical measure, a reflection of the town's responsibility toward those who passed through its boundaries. Both perspectives coexisted, each shaped by individual experience. What remained constant was the presence of the law itself, embedded in the architecture, in the routines, in the expectations that governed behavior. As years turned into decades, the memory of the traveler who had fallen into the narrow alley faded into obscurity. The details of the incident became indistinct, preserved only in fragmented accounts and the occasional mention within records that few consulted. Yet the consequences endured. The secured stairways, the raised barriers, the altered flow of movement across rooftops, these elements persisted, influencing the daily lives of residents and visitors alike. In the broader context of the medieval world, this pattern repeated in countless variations. A market might regulate the arrangement of stalls after a fire spread too quickly through tightly packed goods. A port might enforce new docking procedures following the loss of a vessel during an unusually strong tide. Each regulation traced its origin to a moment when the expected order had been disrupted. These moments did not always carry dramatic significance. Often, they were localized, affecting only a small number of individuals. Yet their impact extended far beyond their immediate circumstances, shaping practices that endured long after the original context had been forgotten. In the town of flat roofs and narrow alleys, the law concerning rooftop access stood as a quiet testament to such a moment. It did not announce itself with grandeur. It did not draw attention to its origins. Instead, it existed as a series of physical and procedural adjustments, integrated seamlessly into the environment. Those who encountered it for the first time might have wondered at its necessity. Those who lived with it daily rarely gave it thought. But in the spaces between stone walls, where shadows gathered and pathways narrowed, the influence of that single incident remained present. A step taken with greater care. A boundary marked where none had existed before. A reminder, subtle yet persistent, that the structures of daily life were not immune to change, and that sometimes the smallest misjudgment could leave a mark that endured for generations. Beyond the inland roads and sunlit rooftops, where dust gave way to salt and the air carried a faint metallic tang, the land opened toward a restless horizon. The coastline there did not present itself gently. It was not composed of wide, forgiving beaches, but of uneven rock, narrow inlets, and shifting tides that revealed and concealed the shoreline in constant rhythm. A settlement had grown along one such inlet, its existence shaped entirely by the sea. Houses clung to elevated ground, their foundations secured against erosion, their walls angled to resist prevailing winds. Between them, steep paths descended toward a small harbor where vessels found temporary refuge. This harbor was not naturally deep. It required careful navigation, guided by markers placed along the rocks and by knowledge passed through generations. At certain hours, the tide withdrew enough to expose hidden formations, jagged outcrops that could tear through the hull of an unwary ship. At other times, the water rose just high enough to allow passage, though even then the margin for error remained narrow. Those who lived in the settlement understood these patterns with quiet precision. They measured time not only by the sun or the bell, but by the movement of water along the shore. Daily life aligned itself with the tide. Fishing, docking, unloading, all depended on moments that could not be altered or delayed. Yet for those arriving from distant ports, the sea appeared deceptively consistent. On a late summer day, when the sky stretched clear and the wind settled into a steady, unremarkable flow, a merchant vessel approached the inlet. It was larger than the boats typically seen in that harbor, its hull deeper, its cargo heavier. The crew had traveled across calmer waters, guided by familiar constellations and predictable currents. From a distance, the harbor seemed accessible. The markers along the rocks were visible, though their meaning was not immediately understood by those unfamiliar with the coastline. The tide, nearing its peak, offered what appeared to be sufficient depth. There was no immediate indication that the window for safe entry was already narrowing. As the vessel moved closer, subtle changes began to occur. The water within the inlet did not behave like the open sea beyond it. Currents shifted direction unexpectedly, influenced by the shape of the rocks beneath the surface. The flow became uneven, creating slight variations in movement that required constant adjustment. For those accustomed to the harbor, these variations signaled caution. For those encountering them for the first time, they could be mistaken for minor disturbances, easily corrected. The vessel continued its approach. At a critical point near the entrance, where the path between submerged rocks narrowed, the tide began its gradual retreat. The change was not abrupt. It unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, altering the depth by degrees rather than in sudden shifts. Within that gradual change lay the danger. The ship, committed to its course, reached the narrow passage just as the water level dropped below the threshold required for safe clearance. The crew responded as best they could, attempting to reverse course, to lighten the load, to stabilize the vessel. Yet the position within the narrow passage left little room for maneuver. The currents, now shifting with the outgoing tide, worked against any attempt to retreat. From the shore, the incident unfolded with a clarity that contrasted sharply with the confusion aboard the vessel. Residents gathered along the rocks, their attention fixed on the struggling ship. They recognized the signs immediately: the timing of the tide, the position of the vessel, the inevitability of what was to follow. Assistance was prepared, though the options were limited. Small boats were launched, navigating carefully through the same hazardous passage that had ensnared the larger vessel. Their purpose was not to salvage the ship, but to retrieve those aboard and recover what cargo could be reached before it was lost. The process was slow, complicated by the conditions that had caused the incident. Each movement required precision, each decision carried weight. By the time the tide had fully receded, the vessel had settled firmly against the rocks, its structure irreparably damaged. What remained above the waterline bore the marks of the encounter: splintered wood, twisted beams, and the unmistakable evidence of a miscalculation. The loss extended beyond the physical. The cargo, intended for trade further along the coast, represented significant value. Its partial recovery did little to offset the overall impact. The vessel itself, once a reliable means of transport, was rendered unusable. For the settlement, the incident was not entirely unprecedented. Ships had encountered difficulties before, though rarely with such consequence. What distinguished this event was the scale and the visibility of the failure. It prompted a reconsideration of how the harbor was approached by those unfamiliar with its conditions. In the days that followed, the local authorities, comprised of experienced sailors, merchants, and those responsible for maintaining the harbor, began to examine the factors that had contributed to the incident. The timing of the tide emerged as a central concern. While residents possessed an intuitive understanding of its patterns, this knowledge was not readily accessible to outsiders. The markers along the rocks, though visible, did not convey sufficient information to guide a vessel of unfamiliar size through the passage safely. There existed a gap between local knowledge and external perception. To address this, a measure was proposed that would alter the way vessels entered the harbor. From that point onward, no ship above a certain size was permitted to approach the inlet without the assistance of a designated guide from the settlement. These guides, drawn from those with extensive experience navigating the local waters, were to meet incoming vessels at a predetermined distance from the shore. Their role extended beyond simple direction. They would assess the conditions, the state of the tide, the behavior of the currents, the dimensions of the vessel, and determine the appropriate moment and path for entry. Without their guidance, passage into the harbor was to be denied. To enforce this regulation, a system of signals was established. From an elevated position overlooking the inlet, observers monitored approaching ships. Flags were raised or lowered to indicate weather conditions permitted safe entry. At night, lanterns replaced these signals, their arrangement conveying the same information in the absence of daylight. The implementation of this system required coordination and consistency. It introduced a new layer of structure to the interaction between the settlement and those who sought to engage with it. At first, the change met with resistance from some merchants and captains. The requirement to wait for a guide, to adhere to external direction, introduced delays and challenged established practices. Yet the memory of the damaged vessel remained present, serving as a quiet reminder of what could occur in the absence of such measures. Gradually, the new procedure became accepted. Vessels approaching the inlet adjusted their schedules to align with the guidance provided. The presence of a local navigator aboard a ship became a standard expectation rather than an unusual precaution. Over time, the system proved effective, reducing the likelihood of similar incidents. As with other laws shaped by singular events, the origin of this regulation began to recede into the background. New generations of sailors encountered the requirement as part of the established order of the harbor. They followed the signals, accepted the guidance, and moved through the inlet with an understanding that had been structured by those who came before them. The damaged vessel, once a visible reminder of miscalculation, was eventually dismantled. Its remains were repurposed where possible, its presence erased from the shoreline. Yet its influence persisted in the practices that had arisen in response to its loss. Beyond the settlement, the concept of guided entry spread to other coastal regions with similar conditions. Each location adapted the idea to its own environment, creating variations that reflected local needs and experiences. In this way, a single incident contributed to a broader pattern of regulation, extending its impact beyond its original context. The sea, with its shifting surfaces and concealed hazards, had once again demonstrated its capacity to disrupt expectation. In response, those who depended on it had introduced a measure of control, not by altering the water itself, but by shaping the behavior of those who navigated it. Within the settlement, life continued in alignment with the tides. Boats departed and returned according to the established rhythms. Goods moved through the harbor, their passage guided by a system that had grown from necessity. The elevated paths between houses remained steady, their foundations secure against the forces below. For those who observed the process without knowledge of its origin, it appeared as a well-ordered routine, an efficient method of managing the interaction between land and sea. Only in the quieter records, in the accounts maintained by those who had witnessed the incident, did the connection remain explicit. A moment when the depth had been misjudged, a passage attempted at the wrong time, a vessel brought to stillness against an unseen edge. From that moment, a law had taken shape, one that would guide countless others safely through the same narrow path. Away from the shifting coastlines and elevated rooftops, the land rose gradually into a region where forests thickened and sound behaved in unfamiliar ways. The trees there grew tall and close together, their trunks forming a dense arrangement that filtered light into narrow beams. Beneath them, the ground was layered with fallen leaves, softened by time and dampened by shade. Within this wooded expanse stood a monastery, positioned deliberately at a distance from major roads. Its presence was not immediately visible to those passing nearby. Only those who knew where to look could find the narrow path that led inward, winding through the trees until the structure revealed itself. The buildings were constructed from stone, their surfaces worn by weather yet carefully maintained. A modest bell tower rose above the central courtyard, its form simple, its purpose clear. The monastery followed a rhythm distinct from the surrounding world, one governed by intervals of work, reflection, and rest. Sound played a central role in maintaining that rhythm. The bell marked the passage of time, its tone carrying through the forest at regular intervals. Within the enclosed space of the courtyard, footsteps echoed lightly against the stone. Beyond the walls, the forest absorbed most noise, allowing only certain sounds to travel clearly. This selective transmission created an environment where specific signals held greater significance. Those who lived within the monastery developed an acute awareness of these signals. They recognized the difference between the rustle of leaves and the movement of an animal, between the distant call of a bird and the approach of a person along the path. Sound, in this place, functioned as both guide and boundary. It was not merely what could be heard. During one autumn season, when the forest floor was particularly dry and the air carried sound with unusual clarity, an incident occurred that would alter this delicate balance. A traveler, moving alone through the woods, approached the vicinity of the monastery without intending to enter it. The path taken was not the established route, but a narrower track used occasionally by hunters and those familiar with the terrain. The traveler carried with them a small object, a metal instrument designed to produce a sharp, resonant tone when struck. Its purpose was practical, intended to signal presence or to startle animals when necessary. As the traveler moved through the forest, the instrument was used intermittently. Each strike produced a clear, ringing sound that cut through the stillness, reflecting off the trunks and dispersing in unpredictable directions. In open areas, the sound faded quickly. Within the dense arrangement of trees, however, it lingered, echoing in ways that altered its origin. At a certain point along the path, the traveler paused and struck the instrument once more. The resulting tone traveled farther than expected. Within the monastery, the sound arrived without context. It did not resemble the bell, nor did it align with any familiar pattern. It was sharper, more abrupt, and it seemed to originate from multiple directions at once. Those within the walls, accustomed to interpreting sound with precision, found themselves confronted with an unfamiliar signal. The response was immediate, though not coordinated. Movement within the courtyard shifted. Attention turned outward, toward the forest. The usual order of activity was interrupted by a shared uncertainty regarding the nature of the sound. In such an environment, Where sound served as a primary means of understanding the surroundings, ambiguity carried weight. The instrument was struck again. This time, the echo traveled along a different path, influenced by subtle variations in the terrain and the arrangement of trees. It reached the monastery from a new direction, reinforcing the impression that the source was not singular. Within the walls, this pattern suggested something unusual. The possibility of multiple individuals approaching from different directions, or of a signal being intentionally altered to create confusion, could not be dismissed. The isolation of the monastery, combined with its limited means of external communication, heightened the significance of such interpretations. Precautionary measures were taken. Access points were secured. Movement beyond the immediate vicinity of the buildings was restricted. The bell, typically used to mark time, was sounded in a different pattern, signaling a state of alert. The forest, meanwhile, remained unchanged in its appearance. The traveler, unaware of the effect produced by the instrument, continued along the path, eventually moving beyond the range at which the sound could be heard within the monastery. The ringing ceased, leaving behind a silence that felt altered by what had preceded it. Within the walls, the absence of further sound did not immediately resolve the uncertainty. Time passed before normal activity resumed. The interpretation of the event lingered, discussed in measured tones, examined from multiple perspectives. The possibility that a simple, unfamiliar sound could disrupt the established order raised concerns that extended beyond the incident itself. In the days that followed, the matter was brought before those responsible for maintaining the internal structure of the monastery's practices. Their deliberations focused not on the traveler, whose identity and intentions remained unknown, but on the conditions that had allowed such confusion to arise. The role of sound within the monastery was central to this examination. It was recognized that the clarity with which certain signals were understood depended on their consistency and exclusivity. The bell, for example, held meaning precisely because its tone was distinct and its use was controlled. Any sound that could be mistaken for a signal, or that could obscure the interpretation of existing signals, introduced an element of uncertainty. From this understanding emerged a decision that would extend beyond the monastery itself. A rule was established concerning the production of sharp, resonant sounds within a defined distance of the monastery grounds. Such sounds, particularly those generated by metal instruments or objects capable of producing similar tones, were to be avoided unless necessary for communication with the monastery. To ensure that this rule was recognized beyond the immediate community, markers were placed along the primary paths leading through the forest. These markers, carved into wood and positioned at intervals, conveyed the restriction in simple terms. Travelers passing through the area encountered these markers without necessarily understanding their origin. Some complied instinctively, adjusting their behavior in response to the instruction. Others, unfamiliar with the significance, continued without alteration. Over time, however, the presence of the markers, combined with occasional reinforcement from those associated with the monastery, established the rule as part of the landscape. The effect of this regulation extended in subtle ways. Hunters modified their practices when moving through the vicinity, relying less on instruments that produced sharp sounds. Travelers became more attentive to the potential impact of their actions within the forest. The monastery, in turn, maintained a clearer distinction between the sounds that signaled routine activity and those that indicated something beyond it. As with other laws shaped by specific incidents, the origin of this rule gradually receded from common awareness. The traveler with the metal instrument remained an anonymous figure, their role in the event unrecorded beyond the immediate accounts of those within the monastery. The confusion caused by the echoes, once a source of concern, became a distant memory. Yet the regulation persisted. It influenced behavior in a manner that was both direct and indirect, shaping the interaction between individuals and the environment in ways that extended beyond the initial context. In the broader sense, this development reflected a recurring pattern. A single, unexpected occurrence revealed a vulnerability within an established system. In response, a measure was introduced to address that vulnerability, often by limiting or guiding behavior. Over time, the measure became normalized, its origin obscured, its presence accepted as part of the natural order. Within the forest, The interplay between sound and space continued. The trees remained as they had been, their arrangement unchanged. The pathways shifted slightly with use, their edges defined by repeated passage. The monastery maintained its rhythm, its bell marking time with consistent precision. Travelers moved through the area with varying degrees of awareness, some noting the markers, others passing without attention. The forest absorbed their presence, its quiet resilience unaffected by individual actions. Yet beneath this continuity, the influence of that single incident endured. A moment when an unfamiliar sound had disrupted the expected pattern. A recognition that even something as intangible as a tone could alter perception. A response that transformed that recognition into a lasting rule. Beyond the boundaries of the monastery, similar considerations arose in other contexts. In towns where signals governed the opening and closing of gates, the use of horns or bells might be restricted to prevent confusion. In regions where communication relied on specific auditory cues, the introduction of new sounds could prompt adjustments to existing practices. Each instance reflected an awareness of how sound, often overlooked in its subtlety, could shape behavior and understanding. In the forested region, this awareness had taken the form of a quiet limitation, one that preserved the clarity of signals within a space where such clarity was essential. And so, the law remained, not as a prominent feature of the landscape, but as a gentle constraint, guiding actions in ways that were rarely questioned. In a valley where the land curved gently between low ridges, there stood a town shaped as much by light as by stone. Its streets followed the natural slope, descending toward a central square where trade and gathering converged. The buildings were constructed from pale material that responded to sunlight with a muted brilliance, absorbing warmth during the day and releasing it slowly as evening approached. Unlike the shaded forest or the enclosed rooftops of distant settlements, this place was defined by openness. The sky remained visible from nearly every angle, its clarity uninterrupted by dense growth or towering structures. Sunlight moved freely across surfaces, tracing patterns that shifted with the hours. Within this environment, light was not merely a background presence. It influenced routine, guided movement, and shaped perception in ways both subtle and immediate. In the early morning, the valley received light gradually, the ridges delaying its full arrival. Shadows stretched long across the streets, creating alternating bands of brightness and dimness that required careful navigation. By midday, the sun stood high, reducing contrast and revealing the town in uniform clarity. Toward evening, the process reversed, with light withdrawing unevenly, leaving certain areas illuminated while others receded into shadow. The people who lived there adapted to these variations without conscious effort. Their activities aligned with the changing conditions, their movements guided by familiarity with how light interacted with the environment. At the center of the town stood a structure that played a significant role in this interaction. It was a hall used for assemblies, its design reflecting both function and local craftsmanship. The roof rose in a gentle arc, supported by a series of beams that allowed for an open interior space. Along the upper portion of its walls were narrow openings, high windows positioned to admit light while maintaining a degree of enclosure. These windows were not fitted with glass as understood in later periods. Instead, they were covered with thin, translucent material that diffused incoming light, softening its intensity while allowing it to illuminate the interior. During most of the year, this arrangement provided a balanced distribution of light within the hall. The interior remained bright enough for gatherings, yet sheltered from the direct glare of the sun. However, there existed a particular time of year when the position of the sun aligned with the angle of the windows in a way that altered this balance. For a brief period, as the season shifted and the sun traced a slightly different path across the sky, its light entered the hall at a precise angle. Instead of diffusing evenly, it passed through the coverings with greater intensity, forming concentrated beams that moved slowly across the interior. These beams were not constant. They appeared at certain hours, shifted gradually, and then disappeared as the sun continued its course. For those accustomed to the usual lighting within the hall, this phenomenon introduced an unexpected variation. One afternoon, during this period of alignment, an assembly took place within the structure. The gathering was routine, involving matters of local importance that required collective attention. The participants arranged themselves within the space according to established patterns, their positions influenced by both custom and convenience. As the assembly progressed, the sunlight entered through the high windows, forming distinct shafts that extended downward. Dust particles within the air became visible as they passed through these beams, creating a subtle visual texture that contrasted with the surrounding dimness. At first, the effect was merely noticeable. The beams moved slowly across the floor and walls, their progression steady yet gradual enough to be overlooked in the context of the ongoing activity. Over time, however, their position shifted toward the central area of the hall, where a reflective object had been placed. This object, composed of polished metal, was part of a ceremonial arrangement. Its surface, maintained with care, possessed a degree of reflectivity that was not immediately apparent under normal lighting conditions. When the concentrated beam of sunlight reached it, the interaction produced an effect that had not been anticipated. The light, striking the polished surface at a specific angle, was reflected outward in a focused direction. The resulting reflection was brighter than the surrounding illumination, its intensity amplified by the concentration of the original beam. This reflected light moved unpredictably as the angle of the incoming beam shifted. It swept across the interior, briefly illuminating areas that had been in shadow, then moving on to others. For those within the hall, the sudden appearance of this bright, moving reflection disrupted the visual consistency of the space. Eyes adjusted to the general level of light found themselves momentarily overwhelmed by the intensity of the reflection. The contrast between the dim interior and the concentrated brightness created a momentary loss of clarity, a disruption in perception that required time to resolve. In such an environment, where attention and awareness were essential to the proceedings, even a brief disturbance could carry consequence. As the reflection moved across the central area, it passed directly through the line of sight of several individuals engaged in the assembly. The effect was immediate, a temporary impairment of vision, accompanied by a shift in focus that interrupted the continuity of attention. In the absence of a clear understanding of the cause, this disruption led to a moment of confusion. Movements became less coordinated. Positions shifted slightly as individuals adjusted to the unexpected brightness. The structured arrangement of the assembly, typically maintained with quiet precision, experienced a subtle yet noticeable disturbance. Though no lasting harm resulted, the incident left an impression. The interaction between light and reflective surface, occurring under specific conditions, had revealed a vulnerability within the design of the space. In the days that followed, the event was examined with care. Those responsible for the maintenance of the hall considered the factors that had contributed to the occurrence. The position of the sun, the angle of the windows, the presence of the reflective object, all played a role in creating the conditions for the incident. The phenomenon was not constant. It occurred only during a particular period and at specific times of day. Yet its potential to disrupt the intended function of the space could not be ignored. From this consideration emerged a response that would shape the use of the hall in the years to come. A regulation was introduced concerning the placement and use of reflective materials within the interior during certain times of the year. Objects with polished surfaces were to be removed or covered when the alignment of the sun created the conditions for concentrated beams of light. In addition, adjustments were made to the coverings of the high windows. Additional layers of material were prepared to be applied during the relevant period to further diffuse the incoming light and reduce its intensity. These measures were implemented with a focus on maintaining the integrity of the space while addressing the specific circumstances that had led to the disruption. As with other regulations born from singular events, the rule extended beyond its immediate context. The awareness of how light could interact with surfaces influenced practices in other areas of the town. In workshops where metal objects were crafted, consideration was given to the placement of reflective materials in relation to natural light sources. In domestic settings, similar adjustments were made during periods when sunlight entered interiors at unusual angles. The incident within the hall thus contributed to a broader understanding of how environmental factors could affect perception and activity. Over time, the specific details of the event began to fade from common memory. The seasonal adjustments to the hull became routine, carried out without reference to their origin. The additional coverings were applied and removed as part of an established cycle, their purpose understood in practical terms rather than historical ones. Those who entered the hull during the period of alignment experienced a consistent environment, unaware of the conditions that had once produced a different effect. Yet the influence of that moment remained embedded in the practices that had arisen in response. A brief interaction between light and surface had altered the way a shared space was managed, introducing a layer of consideration that extended beyond the immediate incident. In the broader pattern of medieval life, this instance reflected a recurring theme, an unexpected occurrence, often tied to the specific characteristics of a place, revealed a potential for disruption. In response, a measure was introduced to mitigate that potential, shaping behavior and practice in ways that persisted long after the original context had receded. In the valley town, where light moved freely and defined the rhythm of daily life, this awareness became part of the collective understanding. The sun continued its path across the sky, its position shifting with the seasons. The hall remained a central point of gathering, its interior shaped by both design and adaptation. The reflective surfaces, when present, were managed with care, their placement guided by an understanding that had been formed through experience. And so, a moment defined by the convergence of light and material gave rise to a rule that, though subtle, influenced the way people interacted with their environment. Northward, where the air thinned and the color of the land faded into muted tones, there existed a region defined by its quiet instability. It was not a place of steep mountains or dramatic cliffs, but of wide, open ground that appeared firm at a distance and uncertain upon approach. The surface shifted subtly with the seasons, responding to temperature and moisture in ways that were not always visible. In the warmer months, the terrain softened. Water gathered beneath the upper layer of soil, held in place by a delicate balance between thaw and absorption. The ground, though seemingly solid, concealed pockets where that balance had tipped, areas where a step could press deeper than expected, where weight was absorbed unevenly. Paths existed, though they were not fixed in the way of paved roads or well-trodden tracks. Instead, they followed routes that had proven reliable over time, marked by memory, by occasional stones placed with intention, and by the faint impressions left by repeated passage. Those who lived within this region developed an understanding of these paths that extended beyond sight. They recognized subtle variations in color, in texture, in the way vegetation grew or failed to grow. These details guided their movement, allowing them to navigate the landscape with a confidence that was not immediately apparent to outsiders. Travelers, however, encountered a different experience. To those unfamiliar with the terrain, the ground appeared uniform. The distinctions that guided local movement were easily overlooked, their significance hidden within patterns that required time to interpret. During one particular season, when the thaw had come earlier than usual and the ground retained more moisture than expected, an incident occurred that would alter how this landscape was approached. A small group set out across the open ground, following what appeared to be a direct route between two distant points. Their intention was to reduce travel time, avoiding the longer path that curved along the edges of the region. The decision was based on observation rather than experience. The surface seemed stable, the weather conditions favorable. At first, the journey proceeded without difficulty. The ground held underfoot, offering resistance that suggested solidity. Each step left only a shallow impression, easily dismissed as a minor variation. The group moved steadily, their progress uninterrupted by any immediate sign of danger. Yet beneath the surface, conditions differed from what was perceived. The early thaw had created layers of saturated soil, separated by thin sections of firmer ground. In certain areas, these layers formed pockets where the upper surface, though intact, rested upon material that could not support significant weight. As the group advanced, they entered one such area. The initial indication was subtle, a slight increase in the depth of each step, accompanied by a change in the sound of movement. The ground, once firm, began to yield more readily. The difference was gradual, not abrupt enough to prompt immediate concern. Then, without clear warning, the surface gave way. One member of the group stepped into a section where the underlying layer had weakened beyond its capacity to hold. The ground collapsed inward, creating a depression that extended beyond the initial point of contact. The surrounding area, already unstable, responded to the sudden shift, widening the affected zone. The result was not a simple fall, but an entrapment. The material beneath the surface, saturated and dense, resisted movement. Attempts to step out of the depression caused further displacement, drawing the surrounding ground inward. The more effort applied, the more the situation intensified. Those nearby attempted to assist, extending support, redistributing weight, seeking to stabilize the area. Yet their actions were constrained by the same conditions that had caused the initial collapse. Each additional movement risked expanding the unstable zone. Time became a critical factor. The effort to extract the trapped individual required coordination and caution, balancing the need for prompt action with the necessity of avoiding further collapse. The process unfolded slowly, marked by careful adjustments and measured responses. Eventually, the individual was freed, though not without consequence. The physical strain of the entrapment, combined with the difficulty of extraction, resulted in injuries that would require extended recovery. The incident did not result in loss of life, yet its impact extended beyond the immediate outcome. For those involved, the experience revealed a dimension of the landscape that had not been fully appreciated. The ground, though outwardly consistent, possessed variations that could not be easily detected without specific knowledge. For the broader community, the event prompted a reconsideration of how movement across the region was managed. In the aftermath, local authorities, drawn from those with experience in navigating the terrain, began to examine the conditions that had led to the incident. Their focus centered on the relationship between seasonal changes and ground stability, and on the ways in which this relationship was communicated to those unfamiliar with the area. The existing paths, though reliable, were not formally marked in a manner that would guide travelers effectively. Their presence was understood by residents, yet not clearly indicated for those passing through. From this assessment emerged a measure that would alter the landscape in a subtle yet significant way. Markers were introduced along established routes, positioned to indicate safe passage across the terrain. These markers took various forms: stones arranged in specific patterns, wooden stakes placed at intervals, and in some areas, low barriers that guided movement along a defined line. The intention was not to restrict access entirely, but to direct it. Travelers entering the region encountered these markers as part of the environment. Their arrangement suggested a path, encouraging movement along routes that had been tested and confirmed as stable under typical conditions. In addition to physical markers, a regulation was established concerning travel during periods of heightened instability. When the thaw reached a certain point and the ground retained excessive moisture, movement across open areas was to be limited. Travel was advised to follow only the marked paths, and in some cases, to be delayed until conditions improved. This guidance was communicated through local networks, reinforced by those responsible for overseeing movement within the region. Over time, the combination of markers and regulation reshaped the patterns of travel. Routes that had once been chosen based on convenience were replaced by paths defined by safety. The landscape, though unchanged in its physical composition, became structured in a new way, its use guided by an understanding that had been formalized through experience. As with other laws arising from singular events, the origin of this measure gradually receded from common awareness. The incident that had prompted its creation became less frequently discussed, its details preserved only in limited records and the memories of those directly involved. New travelers encountered the markers without knowledge of the circumstances that had led to their placement. They followed the indicated paths, accepting them as part of the terrain. For the residents, the markers became integrated into the landscape, their presence as familiar as the ground itself. The regulation concerning seasonal movement was observed as a matter of routine, its purpose understood in practical terms. Yet beneath this normalization lay the influence of that moment when the ground had revealed its instability. A step taken without full understanding. A surface that appeared firm yet concealed uncertainty. A realization that the land itself could not always be trusted to behave as expected. In response, a system had been introduced, not to alter the ground, but to guide those who moved across it. This pattern echoed the developments seen in other regions. Where water had required guidance, signals had been established. Where height had introduced risk, access had been controlled. Where sound had caused confusion, its use had been limited. Where light had disrupted perception, adjustments had been made. In each case, the environment presented a condition that, under specific circumstances, could lead to disruption. The response took the form of a rule, a structure imposed upon behavior to mitigate that risk. In the northern region of Shifting Ground, this structure manifested as a network of markers and a set of practices that governed movement. The land remained as it had been, wide, open, and subtly unstable. The seasons continued their cycle, altering the conditions beneath the surface in ways that could not always be seen. Yet those who crossed it did so with an awareness shaped by experience, guided by markers that traced the memory. Further south, where trade routes converged and space grew scarce within enclosing walls, there existed a town defined by density rather than distance. Its streets did not follow the gentle slopes of a valley nor the open spread of plains, but wound tightly between structures that leaned toward one another as though seeking balance. Upper levels extended outward, narrowing the sky into thin, shifting strips that changed color with the hour. Movement within such a place required constant adjustment. Carts passed with care, their wheels guided through narrow corridors where a slight misalignment could halt progress entirely. Foot traffic flowed in overlapping currents, shaped by routine yet susceptible to interruption. Every space carried purpose, every surface bore the marks of use. Within this environment, animals played a central role in sustaining daily life. They were not confined to distant fields or separate enclosures. Instead, they moved through the same streets as the people who depended on them. Small livestock occupied courtyards and ground-level spaces, while larger animals, used for transport and labor, navigated the narrow passages alongside carts and pedestrians. This shared arrangement functioned through familiarity. Residents understood the behavior of the animals, anticipating their movements and adjusting accordingly. Routes were chosen with consideration for both human and animal traffic, and certain areas were known to be more suitable for specific types of movement. Yet the balance was delicate. It relied on patterns that, while consistent, were not fixed. A change in one element could ripple outward, affecting the flow of the entire system. During a particularly active season, when the town experienced an increase in trade and population, this balance was tested in an unexpected way. The markets were filled beyond their usual capacity. Goods were arranged in tightly packed displays, extending into spaces that were typically kept clear. In the midst of this heightened activity, a group of animals, larger than those commonly seen within the inner streets, was brought into the town. These animals, accustomed to more open environments, had been transported for trade. Their size and unfamiliarity with the confined spaces presented a challenge that was not immediately apparent. At first, their presence caused only minor disruptions. They moved slowly through the streets, guided by handlers who attempted to navigate them through the crowded environment. The animals responded with hesitation, their steps measured, their attention drawn to the unfamiliar surroundings. The situation changed as they entered one of the narrower passages near the central market. This passage, already constrained by the temporary structures and increased foot traffic, offered limited room for adjustment. The presence of the animals further reduced the available space, creating a point of congestion that affected movement in multiple directions. As the animals progressed, their unease became more pronounced. The sounds of the market, voices, the shifting of goods, the movement of carts, echoed between the close walls, amplifying their intensity. The confined space restricted the animals' ability to orient themselves, and the constant proximity of movement on all sides contributed to a growing sense of agitation. One of the animals, reacting to these conditions, shifted its weight abruptly. The movement, though not violent in itself, disrupted the careful alignment required to navigate the passage. The animal's body pressed against the side of a temporary structure, causing it to tilt. The goods arranged upon it began to slide, their balance disturbed. This initial shift set in motion a sequence of events that unfolded with increasing complexity. The tilting structure collapsed, spilling its contents into the passage. The sudden movement and sound intensified the animal's agitation, leading to further unpredictable behavior. The confined space, already limited, became obstructed by fallen goods and the repositioning of those attempting to avoid them. Movement ceased to follow its usual patterns. Instead of flowing, it stalled and redirected in uneven ways. The animals, unable to move forward or retreat easily, responded to the changing conditions with heightened sensitivity. Each adjustment, each attempt to regain control, introduced new variables into an already unstable situation. The passage, designed for continuous movement, became a point of accumulation. Assistance arrived from nearby areas, yet the density of the environment limited the effectiveness of any immediate response. The process of restoring order required careful coordination, balancing the need to clear the obstruction with the necessity of managing the animal's behavior. Eventually, the passage was cleared, and the animals were guided out of the confined space. The temporary structures were dismantled, and the flow of movement gradually returned to its usual pattern. The incident did not result in lasting physical damage beyond the loss of goods and minor structural adjustments. Yet its impact extended beyond the immediate consequences. It revealed a vulnerability within the organization of the town. The coexistence of human and animal movement, while functional under typical conditions, could become unstable when variables exceeded a certain threshold. The introduction of larger animals into already constrained spaces, combined with the temporary alteration of established pathways, had created a situation where the balance could not be maintained. In the days that followed, the matter was brought before those responsible for overseeing the arrangement of the town's internal spaces. Their examination focused on the interaction between space, movement, and behavior. The incident was not viewed in isolation, but as an example of how multiple factors could converge to produce an outcome that disrupted the established order. From this examination emerged a measure designed to address the conditions that had led to the disruption. A regulation was introduced concerning the movement of large animals within the inner streets of the town. These animals were no longer permitted to pass through the most confined passages during periods of high activity. Instead, designated routes were established along wider streets, where their movement could be accommodated without interfering with the flow of the market. In addition, specific times were allocated for their passage. During certain hours, when the density of human activity was lower, the animals could be guided through areas that would otherwise be unsuitable. Outside of these periods, their movement was restricted to the designated routes. The arrangement of market structures was also adjusted. Temporary displays were no longer permitted to extend into key passageways, and the placement of goods was regulated to maintain clear lines of movement. These adjustments, though seemingly minor, contributed to a more stable environment in which both human and animal activity could coexist without conflict. The implementation of these measures required coordination and adherence. Residents and traders adapted their practices, aligning their activities with the new structure. Handlers of animals adjusted their routes and timing, integrating the regulation into their routines. Over time, the changes became part of the town's established order. The designated routes for large animals were recognized and respected, their presence indicated by subtle markers and reinforced by practice. The allocation of specific times for movement created a rhythm that reduced the likelihood of congestion. As with other regulations shaped by singular events, the origin of this measure gradually receded from common awareness. The incident in the narrow passage became less frequently referenced, its details preserved only in limited accounts. New residents and traders encountered the rules as part of the town's structure, their purpose understood in practical terms rather than historical ones. Yet the influence of that moment remained embedded in the organization of the space. A point of congestion had revealed the limits of a system that had once functioned without formal restriction. A sequence of movements, each understandable in isolation, had combined to produce an outcome that required intervention. From that outcome, a new structure had emerged, one that guided behavior, shaped movement, and maintained balance within a densely populated environment. The town continued to thrive, its streets filled with the overlapping currents of daily life. Goods moved through its passages, animals followed their designated routes, and the rhythm of activity persisted. Within this rhythm, The regulation concerning animal movement functioned as an unseen framework, directing interactions in ways that were rarely questioned. It stood as another example of how a single incident, arising from the convergence of specific conditions, could give rise to a lasting rule. Beyond the crowded streets and regulated passages, past the regions where land and structure dictated movement, there existed a territory where coordination depended not on space, but on time itself. It stretched across rolling fields and scattered settlements, linked by roads that wound through open country rather than confined corridors. Distances here were measured less by obstruction and more by duration, and it was duration that shaped expectation. In this region, the passage of hours held a different significance. There were no central towers visible from every point, no single bell whose sound reached all corners simultaneously. Instead, each settlement maintained its own method of marking time. Some relied on small bells, others on shadows cast against marked surfaces, and in certain places, water clocks or simple counting devices were used to measure intervals. These methods, though effective within their immediate surroundings, did not align perfectly with one another. Variations emerged, subtle at first. A bell rung slightly earlier in one village, a shadow interpreted differently in another, a device that measured with small inconsistencies accumulating over the course of a day. Each difference was minor, yet when considered across distance, they produced a lack of uniformity that was rarely acknowledged. For most purposes, this inconsistency caused little concern. Daily routines within each settlement remained coherent. Activities were organized according to local measures, and interaction between neighboring areas adjusted naturally to these variations. Travel occurred with an understanding that time would shift slightly from one place to another, an accepted characteristic of the region. However, there existed certain activities that depended on more precise coordination. Among these was the movement of goods along a series of relay routes that connected distant markets. These routes relied on the transfer of items between carriers at designated points, each transfer occurring at a specific time to maintain efficiency and continuity. The system functioned through a chain of expectations. One carrier would arrive at a point, transfer the goods to another, who would then continue the journey. The timing of each transfer was crucial, as delays or misalignments could disrupt the entire sequence. For a period, the system operated with relative stability. Adjustments were made informally, compensating for minor variations in local timekeeping. Those involved in the process developed an intuitive sense of how these differences manifested, allowing them to maintain the flow of goods without significant interruption. Yet the reliance on intuition carried its own limitations. During one particular season, when the volume of goods increased and the demand for timely delivery became more pronounced, the system was placed under greater strain. The routes extended further, the number of transfers grew, and the margin for error narrowed. At a critical point within this network, an incident occurred that would expose the underlying inconsistency. A transfer point located between two settlements became the site of a misalignment. The carrier approaching from one direction arrived according to the time measured in the originating settlement. The receiving carrier, operating under a slightly different measure, arrived based on the time maintained in the destination settlement. Under normal circumstances, the difference between these measures might have been negligible. On this occasion, however, the variation had accumulated to a point where the two arrivals no longer overlapped. The first carrier reached the transfer point and, finding no one present, waited for a period that seemed reasonable according to the local measure. After that interval passed without the arrival of the receiving carrier, a decision was made to continue forward, assuming that the timing had been miscommunicated. The second carrier arrived later, according to a different measure of time, and found the transfer point empty. Interpreting this absence as a missed connection, a similar decision was made to proceed along an alternate route to compensate for the perceived delay. The result was a divergence. The goods, instead of following the intended path, were carried along separate routes, each based on an assumption formed by inconsistent timekeeping. The sequence of transfers that followed was affected accordingly, with each subsequent point receiving either a delayed delivery or none at all. The disruption extended across multiple settlements. Markets that depended on the timely arrival of goods found themselves without expected supplies. Others received items at unusual times, complicating their distribution. The system, designed for continuity, experienced a fragmentation that revealed its dependence on precise coordination. The incident did not resolve quickly. The divergence of routes required time to correct, as those involved retraced their paths and attempted to realign the sequence. The process highlighted the difficulty of maintaining synchronization across distances where time was not measured uniformly. In the aftermath, the matter drew attention from those responsible for overseeing trade and movement within the region. Their examination focused on the role of timekeeping in coordinating activities that extended beyond a single settlement. The existing methods, though sufficient for local use, proved inadequate for systems that required alignment across multiple points. From this recognition emerged a measure that would alter the way time was understood and managed within the region. A standard method of marking time was introduced, intended to create consistency across settlements. This method did not replace local practices entirely, but established a reference against which they could be aligned. Central to this approach was the designation of specific signals that would be recognized uniformly. At predetermined intervals, signals were to be transmitted between settlements, indicating the passage of time according to the agreed standard. These signals took various forms, depending on the distance and terrain: bells, visual markers, and in some cases, coordinated actions that could be observed across open spaces. The implementation required coordination and commitment. Each settlement adjusted its local measure to align with the standard, recalibrating its methods to reduce variation. The process involved observation, comparison, and gradual refinement, as differences were identified and corrected. In addition to the establishment of a standard, regulations were introduced concerning activities that depended on precise timing. Transfers of goods along relay routes were to occur according to the standardized measure, with allowances made for minor deviations. Waiting periods at transfer points were defined more clearly, reducing the likelihood of premature departure or unnecessary delay. The combination of standardization and regulation reshaped the system. The flow of goods became more predictable, the coordination between carriers more reliable. The network of routes, once subject to the subtle inconsistencies of local timekeeping, gained a structure that extended across the region. As with other laws arising from singular events, the origin of this measure gradually receded from common awareness. The incident at the transfer point, once a source of disruption, became less frequently referenced. The standardized signals and adjusted practices were integrated into daily life, their presence accepted as part of the established order. Yet the influence of that moment remained embedded in the way time was perceived. A realization had emerged that time, though often considered constant, could vary in its measurement and interpretation. This variation, while manageable in isolation, could lead to significant consequences when coordination extended across distance. In response, a system had been introduced to align these measurements, creating a shared framework that guided activity. Across the region, the passage of hours took on a new dimension. The ringing of bells, the observation of signals, the adjustment of local devices, all contributed to a collective understanding of time that transcended individual settlements. The landscape, once defined primarily by physical features, became linked by an invisible structure that governed the rhythm of movement and exchange. Travelers moving through the area encountered this structure in subtle ways. They observed the synchronization of activities between distant points, the consistency of timing in markets and along roads. The presence of standardized signals provided a reference that extended beyond immediate surroundings, offering a sense of continuity across space. For those who lived within the region, the system became a natural part of daily life. They aligned their routines with the standardized measure, adjusting their expectations accordingly. The variation that had once characterized local timekeeping diminished, replaced by a shared rhythm that connected disparate places. And so, a single incident, rooted in the misalignment of time, had given rise to a law that reshaped coordination across an entire territory. In the years that followed the alignment of hours across distant settlements, the landscape did not become quieter, nor did it grow more predictable. Instead, a different kind of awareness began to settle over the places bound by these accumulated rules. It was not an awareness of any single law, but of the possibility that ordinary routines might conceal fragile balances, waiting to be revealed under particular conditions. This awareness did not gather in grand halls or formal records alone. It traveled along roads, lingered in workspaces, and took shape in places where repetition met variation. It moved with those who carried goods, tended animals, measured shadows, or crossed uncertain ground. And in time, it reached a place where neither land nor structure nor time alone dictated behavior, but where the interaction between elements created something less easily understood. There existed, along a broad and slow-moving river far to the east of the earlier valleys, a settlement built upon marshy terrain that resisted complete transformation. The ground had been stabilized where possible, reinforced with timber and stone, yet beneath these efforts the original character of the land remained. Water lay just below the surface, shifting with subtle currents that followed no visible path. The river itself did not rush. It moved with a steady, unhurried force, widening at certain points into shallow expanses before narrowing again between banks reinforced by human effort. Small channels branched from it, threading through the settlement in ways that blurred the distinction between land and water. Bridges crossed these channels at frequent intervals, some permanent, others temporary. Walkways extended across areas where the ground would not support direct passage, their surfaces raised just enough to remain above the dampness below. Movement through the settlement required attention not only to direction, but to the condition of each surface underfoot. In such a place, stability was never absolute. Residents adapted to this condition through routine. They learned which paths remained reliable after heavy rain, which bridges required reinforcement at certain times of year, and which areas should be avoided when the river rose beyond its usual bounds. Among the many activities shaped by this environment, one held particular importance. Storage of goods within the settlement required careful placement. The presence of moisture affected not only the ground, but the air itself. Items susceptible to dampness needed to be elevated, protected from both direct contact with water and from the gradual accumulation of moisture that could alter their condition over time. Structures designed for storage were built with this in mind. Raised platforms, supported by wooden posts, provided a separation between goods and ground. Ventilation was considered essential, allowing air to circulate and reduce the effects of humidity. The arrangement of items within these spaces followed patterns developed through experience, each choice reflecting an understanding of how the environment interacted with materials. Despite these precautions, there remained variables that could not be fully controlled. During a season marked by prolonged rainfall, the settlement experienced a gradual increase in water levels. The river expanded beyond its usual boundaries, filling channels and saturating the ground to a greater extent than in previous years. The changes occurred slowly, allowing for adjustments to be made, yet the cumulative effect altered conditions in ways that were not immediately apparent. Within one of the storage structures, a collection of goods had been arranged according to established practice. The items, consisting of materials sensitive to moisture, were elevated on platforms and spaced to allow for air movement. The structure itself had been maintained regularly, its supports reinforced as needed. At first, the increased humidity presented no visible issue. The air within the structure felt heavier, yet the goods remained unchanged in appearance. The platforms held steady, and the arrangement of items continued to reflect the patterns that had proven effective in the past. Over time, however, a subtle shift began to occur. The prolonged presence of moisture in the air, combined with the elevated water level beneath the structure, created conditions that differed from those previously encountered. The supports, though intact, were subjected to a degree of saturation that affected their stability. The air, carrying a higher concentration of moisture, reduced the effectiveness of ventilation. Within this altered environment, the materials stored on the platforms began to respond. Their surfaces absorbed moisture gradually, their composition changing in ways that were not immediately visible. The weight of the items increased slightly, not enough to be noticed in isolation, but sufficient to alter the balance of the structure when considered collectively. At a certain point, the combined effect of these changes reached a threshold. The supports beneath one section of the platform, weakened by sustained saturation, yielded under the adjusted weight. The shift was not abrupt, but progressive, a gradual descent that altered the alignment of the structure. As the platform tilted, The arrangement of goods upon it shifted in response. Items moved against one another, their new positions creating points of pressure that had not existed before. The stability of the entire section was compromised, leading to a cascading effect in which the displacement of one element influenced others. The result was goods that had been carefully arranged were displaced, some falling into areas where moisture was more pronounced. Others remained in altered positions. Their exposure to the environment changed in ways that affected their condition. The incident did not produce immediate alarm beyond the structure itself. There was no sudden noise that carried through the settlement, no visible sign that drew attention from a distance. Instead, the consequences became apparent over time, as the condition of the goods deteriorated and the extent of the displacement was recognized. The loss, though localized, carried significance. It revealed a limitation within the existing approach to storage in an environment where conditions could shift beyond previous experience. The reliance on established patterns, while effective under typical circumstances, proved insufficient when those circumstances changed. In response, those responsible for managing storage within the settlement undertook a careful examination of the factors involved. Their focus extended beyond the immediate incident to the broader interaction between structure, material, and environment. They considered the effects of prolonged moisture, the capacity of supports to withstand sustained saturation, and the ways in which air movement could be influenced under varying conditions. From this examination emerged a measure that would alter the approach to storage. A regulation was introduced requiring that goods susceptible to moisture be distributed across multiple platforms rather than concentrated in a single area. This distribution reduced the cumulative weight on any one section, decreasing the likelihood of structural failure. In addition, a system of periodic inspection was established. Supports were to be examined at regular intervals, particularly during seasons of increased moisture, to identify signs of weakening before they reached a critical point. Ventilation within storage structures was enhanced through the introduction of additional openings, allowing for greater air circulation. Another adjustment addressed the height at which goods were stored. Platforms were raised further above the ground where possible, increasing the separation between stored items and the moisture beneath. In areas where this was not feasible, alternative materials were introduced to provide a more stable base for the supports. These measures, implemented collectively, reshaped the management of storage within the settlement. The arrangement of goods became more deliberate, guided by considerations that extended beyond immediate convenience. The structures themselves were adapted to accommodate the new requirements, their design reflecting an understanding that had been refined through experience. As with the other laws that had emerged across different regions, the origin of this regulation gradually receded from common awareness. The incident within the storage structure became less frequently discussed, its details preserved only in limited accounts. The practices that arose in response, however, became integrated into daily life, their presence accepted as part of the established order. The settlement continued to exist in its delicate balance between land and water. The river maintained its slow movement, the channels shifted subtly, and the ground retained its underlying instability. Movement through the area remained a careful process, guided by knowledge that combined observation with adaptation. Within this environment, the management of goods took on a form shaped by both necessity and memory. The distribution of weight, the reinforcement of supports, the attention to air and moisture, all reflected a response to a moment when the existing system had revealed its limitations. And so, another law, born from a single incident, became part of the intricate network of practices that defined life within the medieval world. It did not stand apart from the others, but joined them in a quiet continuity. A bridge reinforced by caution, a rooftop marked by boundary, a harbor guided by signal, a forest shaped by sound, a hall adjusted by light, a landscape traced by markers, a town ordered by movement, a region aligned by time, and now, a settlement sustained by the careful balance between weight and water. Each rule carried its own origin, its own moment of disruption, yet together they formed something larger, a pattern of response that extended across places and experiences. A pattern that revealed not only the challenges faced, but the ways in which those challenges were met, understood, and transformed into lasting structure. In this way, the medieval world did not simply endure its uncertainties. It learned from them, one incident at a time.